Okay, hi. So today I want to talk about the Mirror Visitor series. Okay, so this is a fantasy quartet. And usually when I do like reviews of fantasy series, I'm doing more of a guide to the series. So the reason I didn't want to do a guide this time, and I wanted to answer the question of should you read this book, is because of the fourth book. Now, I'll just put the ratings up from Goodreads. So you can see that book 4 takes a pretty big nosedive in terms of how people enjoy it. So as you can see, the fourth book, the last book in a quartet, is very polarizing. So let's just get into it. So this is a quartet that was originally written in French and has been translated to many languages, including English. So we'll start with like a synopsis of the world. So the world itself is broken up into many parts, and there's many different areas, and each of these areas have different pieces of land that are no longer connected and are just kind of floating. So in at least the American versions of the books, that's kind of what the front looks like. There was a cataclysmic event generations ago called the Shattering, I believe. And no one really knows what the world was like before that and why it occurred. But in, I think, 12 or 13 different areas of the land that have been broken up, there are these god-like entities that exist. And they're almost like they're human, but more than human. And but they have not that great of memories, and they're revered and the center of the politics of each of these areas, and each of these areas are very different from each other. So that is the overall world that you're looking in. So now let's talk about the plot itself. So the first book starts out with you following a young adult, I believe, they never actually say her age, who has rejected multiple marriage proposals and now has to take one to a man from a different area of this world. And so it's a betrothal to a mysterious man, and you don't spend much time in the part of the world that she's from, and she gets whisked off to the poles to start her new life. And her new life is not what it seems. He is not what he seems. And you fall into the political machinations of this new place. I enjoyed the first book itself. It's a lot more about the politics and the mystery of this place and trying to understand what's going on because it's so different from the world that she grew up in or the part of the world that she grew up in. And I think that the way that it explores the politics was quite interesting through the use of your protagonist. He still stays, her betrothed still stays a mysterious character for a majority of this book. The first book does not have an ending that will satisfy you if you want to end the series there. So I will say that for every book in the series. None of them end where you feel like you're resolved on things. Moving on, the second book is has more of a mysterious element to it. So the setting is still in the poles, but you do get to see a changed setting. And you get to go to a new area, and then there is a mystery kind of that needs to be solved, and your protagonist is at the center of it. And again, you're swept up into the politics. Your character has a little bit more autonomy, and she understands a little bit more of what's happening. And you get to see that occur, and then you get to see the relationship between her and her betrothal develop. Then this feels kind of like its own first arc. And then because the third book starts 3 years later, so you have a big time lapse. And again, you get a new setting. where you're in a completely new part of the world, and it has a academia setting. So now you're in this strict, regimented, competitive academic setting that feels very different from the energy of the first two books. You get very different characters at play that are introduced, and your protagonist is in a very different political and social position than where she was at in the first two books. And the fourth book kind of continues on that story that is set up in the third book, with the exception that now you get to see some different parts of the world because you get a secondary perspective that is showing up here and there. So that's the general setup of these books. I think that something that is hard to define with these is the age range. So books, at least in the United States, are very much marketed towards a certain audience. And I would have trouble delineating where this book would be marketed. Your protagonist's age is never really defined. And I think that becomes challenging because she's very small and she looks very young. And so she's definitely a young adult, but she's treated very young, and she also acts very young, and she has a lot of challenges taking on autonomy. And so part of this series is her finding her own autonomy, which feels like in the United States that would be marketed to a YA audience. It also is not explicit in its content. And so it's not that gross. It doesn't have sexual content. Everything is more implied than is on the page. But it's not explicitly about teenagers. It's about a betrothal. So I think tonally that can be challenging for some readers where it doesn't really fit into a box. And I think that you can see that with how I described the general synopsis vibe of each book, where they're all kind of doing a little bit different of a thing. One thing about the world that I didn't really talk about is the magic. So the world is kind of separated into 12 or 13 different places. Each of these places is ruled by that like god person, and everyone who lives in those places are the descendants of that god-like figure. And so you have different magics that come from that person, and it's not just one for each of those people in areas. It's like it can kind of come about differently. So your protagonist is a mirror visitor, where she can go through mirrors, though there's a lot of limitations around it. She is also a reader, so she can read an object and see its past in terms of like the emotional state of the people who were handling it and how they handled it. There are different people who can have like kind of hive mind, where if you're in the family, everyone can see what everyone else is doing. There are people who can create illusions. There are people who can create pain in another. So there's a lot of different skill sets and magic powers that are explored within this book, though not as heavily as maybe some would like. I think including the protagonist's own powers at some points. You're not super deeply involved in her utilizing her powers constantly. A lot of the time, it feels like a non-magical world until the magic gets used, which I think kind of does this book a disservice at times. I think that the book, it also has a hard time finding itself in the romance category. I think that people who don't like a romantic undertone in books won't be super intrigued by this. It starts with a betrothal, so it's kind of implied that it could end up going there, but I never really felt a connection to the relationship between the protagonist and her betrothed as it was developing. It just seems to kind of happen. And so I think that it could, even though it's a long road to developing with a lot of kind of backslides and stuff, it's never really totally feeling secure. I think it can kind of feel like a little bit of insta love at times. And it can also feel like there's a lot of miscommunication tropes happening. So that can, I think, be frustrating for a lot of audiences as well, because sometimes it's just about people talking to each other to resolve an issue. And this kind of hangs on the idea of like not being able or not feeling comfortable having a conversation, and just getting things out there, which leads to a lot of the distress that your protagonist is facing through this book. And it's not just in her relationship with her betrothal or betrothed, it's in her relationships with others around her. Another part of this book that I think is challenging at times is the translation. So I didn't find this particularly bad in the first few books, but there's some words that are translated in the third book specifically that modern readers are not going to appreciate. They're not in the modern, they're not politically correct at this point, and it does feel like the author maybe learned English and used English about 40 years ago consistently, and hasn't modernized their slang or their terms for things. I don't actually want to say the words that are used because I find it, I'm not gonna say them. I don't use them, and I think that that's kind of challenging for readers as well, because it is more YA, and it isn't like not explicit, but then sometimes it's just like this word is used out of nowhere and it's like, why is that happening? So I think that that's something that people do not like in some of the books. I think that we need to talk about the mystery of it all, because this book itself, like I said, it feels like two separate series that are combined into one, or like two duologies that make up like one series. So there is kind of a closed arc at the end of the second book where you still have a lot of questions because of like the kind of cliffhanger elements that it's left with, but there's resolution of things. But then the third and fourth book really are kind of fundamentally grasping at why is the world the way it is? What caused the world to look like this? What caused the godlike figures to be how they are? And what is the big mystery of this universe that they're living in? And if you want a rational, reasonable, good answer, you are not going to find it. This book, the fourth book, completely lost me about 50% of the way in. Like, it was the connections that were being made, the realizations about the characters and how they tied into everything that happened. Like, I really had to squint my eyes and turn my head to find the reason. And at a certain point I was just like, okay, whatever, like I guess I'm just gonna go with it. And but if you love the series up until that point and you're like, what is the answer to all of this, you're gonna be completely let down by that ending. So I don't know what else to say there. That's just going to let a lot of readers down, and you just should be aware of it going into it. The reviews of the fourth book and like the rating of the fourth book really suggests that that's what happens, but Yeah, and then it still kind of ends in a mysterious element with some things where you don't really get that completely satisfying ending of where your like the stability of your characters, I guess, in some capacity. So, that's all. I hope that this is helpful in deciding if you would want to read this series, but that is all I have. So until next time, happy reading.